Warning, this super edgy episode just might have some mature content. By mature, we mean juicy details about those oh-so-dull historical events with graphic descriptions. Kids, you might need a babysitter for this one, because we wouldn't want you to accidentally learn something about history. God forbid. Enjoy. Or don't, we don't care, and just a tiny little thing to keep in mind. We all love being interrupted by ads while trying to enjoy some precious historical content. It's not like we could do without those ever-so-fascinating paid promotions that miraculously support the podcast's production costs. But hey, who needs an uninterrupted historical journey when you can have some good old product placements, right?
Broadcasting live from an undisclosed bunker, it's the Reasonably Priced Time Machine podcast, with your host, Professor Ryan Lancaster. Also featuring a good dose of mediocrity from the talents of Archie and Hildy. Episode 75, Tobacco and Rum, or the 17th Century Starter Pack.
Welcome to the RPTM podcast, where history isn't a lesson, it's a clearance sale in the basement of human failure.
Today's bargain bin topics include Squanto, 17th century music that makes Gregorian chants sound like party anthems, and of course, alcohol. The MVP of colonial survival.
We'll also hit the Headright System, tobacco brides who were literally shipped like Amazon packages, and, oh yes, 1619, when America decided it was time to supercharge its moral bankruptcy with slavery.
And for dessert? Pocahontas, the only Disney princess whose life story ends like a bleak indie film. Strap in because time is meaningless, and so is everything we're about to say.
What does Professor Lancaster think? Race in America.
America didn't stumble into racism like it was a crack in the sidewalk. No, it engineered it, brick by brick, law by law, whip crack by whip crack. You can't talk about liberty here without gagging on the fumes of hypocrisy that have been leaking since 1619, when a boatload of terrified Africans was dumped into Virginia like human cargo on clearance. This wasn't a historical oopsie. This was a deliberate pivot toward profit with human flesh as the foundation. The Enlightenment might have been blooming across the Atlantic, but in the colonies, Enlightenment was counted in bushels of tobacco and bodies in chains. Before you start humming Land of the Free, remember, freedom had a color code. Spoiler alert, black didn't make the list. The shift from indentured servitude to race-based chattel slavery wasn't some natural evolution. It was a hostile takeover of the human soul. Why rent a life when you can own it? The plantation class did the math, and black bodies became generational assets. America found its cash cow. Then came the Virginia Slave Codes of 1705. Less legal code, more instruction manual for turning people into property. And don't get me started on Jefferson, that walking contradiction wrapped in Enlightenment prose. Wrote about equality while cashing checks off bondage. The dude was tweeting about liberty with one hand and running a slave-powered startup with the other. Let's talk Puritans, God's chosen hall monitors. They brought Bibles, guilt, and a work ethic sharp enough to grind the soul out of a man. Mix that with capitalism and some Calvinist spice, and suddenly black folks weren't just enslaved, they were sinners by default, born lazy, born criminal, born wrong. This wasn't cultural poison, it was moral arson. The whole deserving poor and hardworking whites routine, a con job, a grift, wrapped in scripture, sold with economic incentives. What better way to justify theft than pretending God handed you the deed? And if you're not furious yet, check your pulse. Any system built on coercion, categorization, and generational domination isn't liberty. It's a boot on the neck, shrink-wrapped in a flag. But here's the truth they didn't put in the textbooks. The enslaved weren't passive extras in a sad national tragedy. They were fighters. They ran, rebelled, strategized, preached, and bled. Harriet Tubman didn't lead people to freedom. She operated a one-woman spec ops unit behind enemy lines. Frederick Douglass wasn't asking politely. He was carving slaveholders open with words so precise they could double as surgical instruments. These weren't cries for pity. They were battle hymns, declarations of earned liberty, not borrowed crumbs. Every whip-scarred back, every runaway's muddy footprint, that was the real America. Not the statues, not the powdered wigs. That. Then came emancipation. Slavery was legally dead, allegedly, but white supremacy just mutated. Faster, sleeker, better branding. Cue Jim Crow, dressed like Law and Order, acting like a lynch mob, separate but equal, was a punchline with no joke. Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896 legalized apartheid with a wink and a gavel. You wanted liberty? Pass a Kafkaesque literacy test and get past a man with a shotgun. The civil rights movement was not charity, it was the next phase of insurrection. Rosa sat, Malcolm roared, Martin dreamed, and bled. And still, the lash echoes through red-lined neighborhoods, over-policed streets, and schools so unequal they make your teeth itch. Now we're in 2025, and guess what? The ghost of slavery is still rattling chains in America's attic. Housing policy, healthcare disparities, courtroom bias. It never left. It just changed its LinkedIn title. George Floyd's murder wasn't a wake-up call. It was the alarm blaring for the 10th time. Protesters weren't looters. They were oracles, pointing at the cracks in the foundation we keep slapping duct tape over. If you're a historian, a rational mind who believes in dignity over doctrine, then you've got to call this what it is. Institutionalized theft of agency. And this isn't just America's mess. Colonial Europe took notes. Apartheid in South Africa, Jim Crow's evil twin, racial caste systems in Latin America, same software, different accent. Racism, once industrialized in the US, became a global franchise of exploitation. But here's the rub. Every state-sponsored division is an assault on the individual. If the individual is sacred, then racism is heresy, period. So what do? We study it. Not to wallow in guilt or rack up grievance points, but to understand the machine. Why it was built, how it runs, and how to rip the gears out. Because history isn't dead data, it's a field guide to power. Studying slavery? That's blueprint analysis. Studying resistance? That's learning how to jam the lock. Slavery and racism weren't bugs. They were features, hard-coded. But code can be rewritten. That's the challenge. That's the hope. Because if liberty means anything, it means everyone gets a shot. No chains, no codes, no damn compromises. So light your cigars. Open your books. Flip the damn table. We've got work to do.
Squanto.
Squanto, better known as Tisquantum, lived a life of abduction, survival, diplomacy, and betrayal. His tale is no historical footnote buried in a dusty textbook. It's a vivid kaleidoscope of cultural collision, human resilience, and the steamrolling force of colonialism. Through his journey, we glimpse liberty, unintended consequences, and the tangled mess of coexistence in a world being violently remade. Born into the Pawtuxet people in what we now call New England, Squanto grew up in a land untouched by European steel, gunpowder, or smallpox. His world thrived on the rhythms of indigenous life until 1614, when that rhythm was shattered. Enter Thomas Hunt, an English trader with the ethics of a two-bit pirate and the empathy of a tax collector. Hunt abducted Squanto and others, dragging them across the Atlantic to be sold into slavery in Spain. That should have been the end. Instead, it was the beginning of a long, improbable arc. Squanto escaped captivity, made his way to England, and learned the language of his captors, possibly picking up a taste for tea and sarcasm along the way. His survival was nothing short of miraculous, a one-man embodiment of grit, navigating the early days of globalization with nothing but his wits and the instincts of a man who refused to vanish. When he returned to his homeland in 1619, it was gone. The villages? Empty. The people, dead, wiped out by an epidemic likely carried by European ships. It was a biological apocalypse, a silent massacre, a gift from the old world to the new. The echoes of his people were all that remained, ghosts haunting a land reclaimed by silence. The law of unintended consequences had struck with surgical cruelty, proof that good intentions and bad germs travel on the same winds. By 1621, Squanto had transformed once more, this time into a go-between, a cultural broker for the struggling pilgrims of Plymouth Colony. He taught them how to plant maize, fertilize with fish, and not die in the woods. But was he a benevolent teacher or a shrewd operator, playing both sides for his own survival? Probably both, because real people don't fit neatly into parables. His actions highlight the potential of voluntary collaboration, but also the razor-thin line between diplomacy and manipulation, especially when power isn't equally shared. Naturally, the Pilgrims mythologized him. Governor William Bradford and Edward Winslow wrote Squanto into their colonial gospel as a divine instrument of salvation, sent to validate their mission. But history isn't written by the saved, it's written by the survivors with printing presses. And in their telling, Squanto's complexity was flattened into a morality tale. For those who believe in liberty, dignity, and individual agency, his story urges us to challenge the monopoly on historical narrative and amplify the voices that were left out. Then there's Thanksgiving, that sanitized slice of Americana served with cranberry sauce and half-truths. In the national myth, Squanto becomes the smiling native at the first feast, but the real story is darker and more tangled. It's not about harmony, it's about survival, hope laced with heartbreak. His life demands we reject the fairy tale and face the real question. How do we square the ideals of freedom and justice with the historical machinery that crushed entire peoples? How do we move forward with honesty, dialogue, and a sense of repair? Squanto's legacy also forces us to confront the paradox of cultural exchange. The power to connect and enrich, but also to dominate and destroy. He bridged two worlds with astonishing grace, but the bridge was built over the wreckage of his own people. Still, his example reminds us that genuine cooperation, free from coercion, can spark something enduring. It's a principle worth fighting for, especially in a world still wrestling with empire's long shadow. In the end, Squanto's story isn't a neat narrative. It's a jagged mosaic, pieced together from trauma, triumph, and the raw stuff of human endurance. It dares us to challenge tidy history, to remember that progress is not inevitable, to honor not just the names in textbooks, but the unnamed multitudes whose lives shaped this land. History is not a parade, it's a reckoning, and Squanto walks right through its center, haunted, resilient, and unflinchingly real.
17th century music.
Let's drop the needle. It's colonial America. A raw, roaring, ungovernable jam session of idealism, greed, desperation, and defiance. Jamestown kicks things off in 1607, and from there, society lurches forward like a Rube Goldberg machine made of buckles, tobacco, and broken treaties. Somewhere in the chaos, a sound emerges, not polished, not pure, but alive. The soundtrack of a people caught between liberty and control begins to crackle into existence. This isn't just a story of dusty psalms or folksy fiddles echoing in the hills. It's about music as rebellion, survival, prayer, and protest. A needle stitching together the torn fabric of a fledgling nation, humming with contradiction and wild intent. Picture the Puritans landing in New England, clutching the Ainsworth Psalter in one hand and a death grip on joy in the other. To them, music is sacred, stripped of beauty for the sake of purity. The Bay Psalm Book of 1640, America's first printed volume, is so unmelodic it could make Gregorian chants sound like Donna Summer. Their songs weren't sung, they were endured. But music, like water and heresy, finds cracks to slip through. Despite the Puritan stranglehold, sound begins to evolve. Pipe organs sneak into churches, fiddles tiptoe into barns, melody softens dogma. By the time butter starts melting in the New England sun, so too does the rigidity. And here begins the backbeat of American identity, a constant tug of war between creativity and control, tradition and improvisation, authority and soul. Meanwhile, out in the Appalachian hills, settlers are playing a whole different tune, raw, ragged, defiant. They brought their fiddles, ballads, and foot stomps from Ireland and Scotland, but the frontier turned those songs feral. Appalachian music wasn't just art, it was therapy, identity, and protest. Every bow scrape and boot tap screamed, "We're still here." It was folk music without pretense. DIY before punk, sacred and profane, hillbilly baroque. It didn't care for orthodoxy, it was music for survival, and a warning shot to elites who tried to define culture from above. But if you want to hear the deepest baseline in America's musical DNA, listen to the enslaved. Dragged here in chains, African peoples brought with them not just rhythms and melodies, but an entirely different philosophy of sound. In the fields and on the plantations, music was resistance. Spirituals, work songs, call and response chants. They weren't just laments, they were lifelines. They clapped where drums were banned. They danced where joy was punished. They made instruments from bones and scraps and soul. The banjo, born of African lutes, the polyrhythms that would one day electrify jazz, funk, and hip-hop, poured out first on dirt floors by people who refused to let their culture die. That is not just legacy, that is revolution. Music became the one place where liberty could hide out and gather strength, even when the body was shackled. African American music reshaped every genre it touched, and it touched everything. Then you've got William Billings, the scrappy psalm-slinging rabble-rouser of Boston. No powdered wig, no aristocratic polish. He wrote what he wanted, how he wanted. Musical anarchy in a world of rigid harmony. His compositions were democratic in spirit, punk in delivery, and 100% American in their refusal to be polite. But where there's sound, there's also silence. Native American music, rich with history and spiritual depth, was ruthlessly suppressed. Colonial powers banned ceremonial drumming and singing. African rhythms were commodified while their creators were dehumanized. The early American soundscape is both a hymn of hope and a dirge of denial, a symphony made from exploitation and brilliance alike. Fast forward a few centuries and those early vibrations are still shaking the walls. Jazz, blues, country, rock, hip-hop, they don't just descend from this musical genesis. They are evolved. Every bass drop, every power chord, every sample and freestyle is built on foundations laid by Puritans, pioneers, and the enslaved. The contradictions are baked in: freedom and bondage, faith and rebellion, creation and control. And if we're really listening, really paying attention, we hear it. The unresolved chord of America itself, not perfect, not finished, but ringing out, loud, human, defiant. Because freedom, in the end, isn't just a political idea, it's a sound, a dissonant, beautiful, unfinished melody. And in early American music, you can hear it struggling to be born.
17th century alcohol.
The victors write history, sure, but colonial America? That history is scribbled in drunken handwriting on the back of a rum-soaked receipt. Welcome to the wild world of the New World, where booze wasn't just a social lubricant, it was a survival strategy, an economic engine, and a moral minefield. So pour yourself a drink and let's stumble into the hazy taverns of early America. Let's start with the Puritans, the stoic, buckle-shoed pilgrims fleeing religious persecution and chasing an endless tap of ale. The Mayflower wasn't just a ship, it was a floating pub. Clean water was a gamble, often contaminated, sometimes lethal. Beer was safer. Beer was salvation in a bottle. Even Increase Mather, a man who made brimstone sermons a full-time job, once declared, "Drink is in itself a good creature of God." Translation, God's cool with a cold one. Who are we to argue? This wasn't hedonism, it was pragmatic piety. Colonists cultivated wild hops and refined beer recipes, and by 1657, Boston had its first rum distillery humming. The colonists were hustling, alchemizing sugar, sweat, and survival into commerce. Until, of course, the cost came due. Enter rum, the sweet, molasses-born juggernaut that transformed New England into an economic beast. It wasn't just for colonial toasts. Rum powered the infamous triangular trade, shuttling goods between New England, the Caribbean, and West Africa. But let's not romanticize it. This was capitalism with blood on its hands. For every barrel of rum produced, there was a hidden invoice in human lives. Enslaved people were traded, brutalized, and commodified, all in service of a liquor economy. The ideals of free enterprise, here they collided head-on with human decency, leaving behind a moral hangover still lingering centuries later. Back home, alcohol flowed freely through the veins of daily life. Weddings, funerals, harvest festivals, town hall meetings. Booze was always on the guest list. In many ways, it was the original social network. Before Facebook walls, there were tavern walls, and everyone was posting. But the party had its limits. Colonial leaders began to notice that the line between merriment and mayhem was razor thin. As the tankards clinked, early temperance warnings started to creep in. Even back then, America was wrestling with a fundamental contradiction: how to balance personal freedom with collective responsibility, one stiff drink at a time. And then there's the other story, the one often poured last and least. For Native American communities, alcohol didn't just arrive as a trade good, it came as a cultural wrecking ball. While colonists used liquor to lubricate their society, for many indigenous peoples, it became a corrosive force. Already grappling with displacement, disease, and genocide, tribes now faced an imported crisis in liquid form. Alcohol, sometimes deliberately introduced, became a tool of manipulation, dependency, and cultural erosion. What began as barter became something far more insidious: a slow drip form of imperialism with devastating consequences. So what do we moderns take from all this? Colonial America's relationship with alcohol isn't just a quaint tale of tankards and trade, it's a mirror. It reflects ingenuity and greed, celebration and destruction, profit and pain. The rum industry stands as a monument to human creativity. but also a cautionary tale of what happens when ambition outruns morality. And those early debates over temperance, they echo in today's headlines about addiction, regulation, and the blurry lines between liberty and liability. In the end, alcohol in colonial America wasn't just something people drank, it was something they lived by. It built towns, it tore apart lives, it brought people together, and it split cultures in two. History may not always repeat itself, but it certainly does slur its words.
And now, a short commercial break and a word from our sponsors.
Hey podcast listeners, are you tired of the constant hustle and bustle of modern life? Do you long for a break from the chaos, stress, and endless notifications? Well, have we got something for you? Introducing Nothing. That's right folks, Nothing, the revolutionary concept taking the world by storm. In a world filled with distractions, Nothing offers you a chance to truly unwind, unplug, and rediscover the art of doing. Well, nothing. Imagine this, no more crowded schedules, social media overload, and no more FOMO. With Nothing, you can finally savor the blissful moments of silence and tranquility you've been craving. Picture yourself lounging in a hammock, gazing at the sky, or perhaps taking a stroll with no destination. Nothing allows you to appreciate the world, contemplate quietly, and recharge your mind and body. But wait, there's more. When you order Nothing today, you'll receive a complimentary guide on the ancient art of daydreaming. Our experts will teach you how to let your mind wander, explore your inner thoughts, and tap into your creativity. So why wait? Say goodbye to the noise and chaos, and say hello to Nothing. Order your Nothing experience now, and take that first step towards a more mindful and fulfilling life. Remember, it's not about doing something, it's about doing nothing. Embrace the emptiness. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming. Headright System.
It's 1618, and Jamestown, Virginia is on the brink of collapse. Tobacco is king, but there's a dire shortage of labor to tend the fields. In this desperate scenario, the Headright System emerges, a capitalistic fever dream concocted by men in buckled hats. They enticed with 50 acres of land like a lifeline to anyone willing to make the arduous journey across the Atlantic. Thus began one of American history's most gloriously chaotic and morally questionable episodes. The idea was devilishly simple: 50 acres per head brought to Virginia. For sharp-eyed opportunists like George Menifee, this was a free opportunity in bulk. In 1638, Menifee imported over 60 enslaved Africans and walked away with 3,000 acres of prime soil. Not a land grab, a land empire built on a ledger that rewarded cold, calculated ambition. To the downtrodden masses of Europe, it seemed like salvation, land, autonomy, and a chance to overthrow the aristocracy, the ruling class of nobles and landowners. To the colonial elite, it was a system of infinite leverage, expanding estates without ever dirtying their hands. Economic Darwinism at its rawest, the clever, the lucky, and the ruthless thrived. But there's always a catch. Couldn't afford passage? No problem. Just sell yourself into indentured servitude. 5 to 7 years of backbreaking labor under a sponsor who'd work you to the marrow and maybe toss you a patch of worthless frontier dirt in return. If you lived that long, disease, starvation, and native raids culled the unprepared. Survivors emerged battered and broke, while their sponsors sat fat and satisfied atop acres of other people's suffering. Indentured servitude was exploitation with an expiration date. Slavery was the eternal upgrade. By the mid-1600s, the elite realized that white servants eventually got ideas about rights, wages, and land. Africans, forced into bondage for life, were immune to such legal technicalities. When enslaved people became headright eligible, the whole system mutated into a racialized jackpot. Menifee and his ilk weren't just playing the game, they were ruthlessly exploiting it, perpetuating a system of inequality and injustice. The rhetoric of freedom and opportunity evaporated. What remained was a land factory that turned human suffering into property deeds. By 1676, the cracks in this plantation paradise had split into chasms. Poor settlers, ex-servants, and landless drifters, tired of promises that never paid, rallied behind Nathaniel Bacon. Their fury, it aimed at Native Americans naturally, but also the land-hoarding elites. Bacon's rebellion was a chaotic cocktail of populist rage and tragic misfire. It climaxed in fire, with Jamestown in ashes, and ended with Bacon dying of dysentery. But the warning was clear: squeeze the lower classes too hard, and they'll come back swinging. The elite's response? Clamp down, harden the racial caste lines. Slavery was safer than another white uprising. It is better to chain one race forever than risk giving the other ideas. And just like that, the die was cast for centuries of racial injustice. The Headright System was America's first big experiment in incentivized ambition. It unleashed dreams and exploited bodies. It made landowners out of nobodies and monsters out of merchants. We can admire the grit, the hustle, the wild-eyed vision, but we can't ignore the rot built into the foundations. It's not just a historical curiosity. It's a blueprint, a cautionary tale about how systems designed to reward drive and initiative can so easily be hijacked by greed and turned into machines of misery. The lesson? Be careful what you incentivize, you might get it. Or, as George Menifee might have said, land is power, but power always collects interest.
Tobacco brides.
Jamestown, the ambitious dream of the New World, but a far cry from the shining city on the hill. Picture the desperate Englishmen hacking through dense, oppressive brush with one hand, a pipe in the other, their fantasies of gold fading into the suffocating Virginia air. By 1619, the colony was barely holding on. Disease, starvation, and bloody skirmishes with the Powhatan Confederacy had turned it into a grim survival experiment, not the beacon of civilization the Virginia Company had promised. Enter the tobacco brides, a practical yet almost absurd solution dreamt up by the Virginia Company. Ship over 144 English women to marry the struggling settlers, with the price tag set at 150 pounds of tobacco per bride. Tobacco wasn't just a crop anymore, it was currency, dowry, and salvation. Forget love, these matches were brokered by cold, hard capitalism. But let's not sugarcoat it. This wasn't some Austen-esque romance. These women weren't stepping off ships with dainty parasols and poetic musings. They were stepping into a battle for survival, an existential gamble where the stakes were nothing less than life or death. Yet, despite the odds, they showed incredible courage and resilience. Jamestown was a mess, a bachelor's haven on the brink of collapse. High mortality, scarce resources, and a lack of family life created a colony that felt more like a chaotic, man-heavy outpost than a functioning society. The Virginia Company, ever the savvy corporate minds, saw the problem and the solution. We need stability, they must have reasoned. Nothing brings stability like families. The remedy? A strategic sale. Come all, lonely gents, for the low price of 150 pounds of tobacco, secure a wife to call your own. Ruthless, yes, but effective. These women were far more than romantic partners. They were investments in the colony's future, a strategic move designed to bring balance to the chaos. And it worked. Families formed. Children were born. The colony began to take root. But let's not pretend this was some Edenic success story. The women weren't exactly scanning Tinder profiles for potential husbands. They were making a grim choice between the known miseries of England and the unknown horrors of the New World. Now let's talk about choice, because that's a tricky word here. These women were marketed as adventurous spirits, willing pioneers chasing destiny. But when you peel back the layers, the truth is far murkier. In 17th century England, women on the fringes had few options. Economic prospects were limited, and social mobility was a pipe dream. You didn't get on that ship unless you were desperate or forced. So what greeted them in Jamestown? A colony where the odds of dying from disease or conflict were about as likely as not. The Virginia Company had essentially turned these women into commodities, bought and sold, marketed like products in a marketplace. But the women weren't passive victims. They adapted, they survived, and in many cases, they thrived, reshaping the social fabric of Jamestown with grit and determination. Take Anne Burris, for example. She arrived in 1608 as a maidservant, married a laborer, and endured unimaginable hardships. Her survival epitomized the resilience these women brought to the table. But let's not romanticize it. Burris and her fellow brides were cogs in a machine built on brutality, their agency largely suffocated by necessity. And here's where things take a darker turn. 1619 was a watershed year for Jamestown. Not only did the tobacco brides arrive, but so did enslaved Africans. It was the beginning of an intertwined history of family building and oppression, where the demand for labor, both voluntary and forced, grew hand in hand with the monoculture economy. The commodification of women was a precursor to the colony's growing reliance on enslaved labor. Tobacco, that golden crop, rested on the backs of both groups. Whether they volunteered or were forced, the economy didn't care about their humanity, it cared about output. So, what do we make of all this? The tobacco brides were both victims and agents of change. Their stories are a testament to human adaptability, surviving against absurd and overwhelming odds. They were pioneers, yes, but they were also pawns in a much larger game, one played by empires and economies far beyond their control. Today, their story resonates in the ongoing debates about migration, labor, and gender equality. The veneer of choice often masks coercion, just as it did then. But there's also inspiration to be drawn. Despite the odds, these women built lives, families, and communities that laid the foundation for what would become the United States. The lesson? Progress is never easy, and it's often paid for by the vulnerable. If we're serious about learning from history, we'd better face the costs and start rewriting the future. After all, history isn't some fixed script. It's a guidebook we're free to edit. So light up that metaphorical cigar, pour yourself a stiff drink, and raise a glass to the tobacco brides, not as saints or victims, but as real, messy humans caught in the machinery of history.
African slavery.
Somewhere under the sweltering August sun of 1619, as mosquitoes swarmed and tobacco fields stretched like a green sea to the horizon, the White Lion docked at Point Comfort, Virginia. Its cargo wasn't gold, spices, or even the hard-won fruits of exploration. It was people. About 20 Africans disembarked, their chains clinking a grim overture to the coming symphony of American contradictions. Welcome to Liberty's proving ground, where high ideals and low deeds collide head-on. Virginia was no shining city on a hill. It was a capitalist Wild West draped in Puritan robes. Tobacco was the cash cow, and English settlers were hell-bent on milking it. The arrival of these Africans, ripped from a Portuguese slaver and traded for food and cattle, wasn't strategic. It was a grab-and-go moment of pure opportunism, a cold transaction, a chilling glimpse of what would become the machinery of American bondage. Early on, things were murky. These Africans were technically indentured servants, meaning they might someday earn freedom. But might is the devil's favorite loophole. Colonists quickly realized there was more money in permanent slavery than second chances. Thus began the grim calculus of commodifying people, an economic formula Wall Street would blush to claim. By 1640, the mask was off. Enter John Punch, an African man sentenced to lifetime servitude for running away, while his white co-conspirators got off with a few extra years. That ruling didn't just punish Punch, it set the legal precedent for race-based slavery in America. From there, the floodgates opened. Children inherited their mother's enslaved status. Interracial relationships were criminalized. Freedom became a gated community for white Christians only. Let's not pretend this was ever about race at first. It was about profit. Race came later, as a justification. The colonies were capitalism's petri dish, and slavery was its most grotesque mutation. By the mid-17th century, tobacco profits were booming, greased by the blood and labor of the enslaved. Slavery didn't just support the economy, it was the economy. And the Founding Fathers, they didn't just inherit this system, they perfected it. Thomas Jefferson wrote sonnets to liberty while keeping over 600 human beings in bondage. He wasn't an outlier, he was the blueprint. Fast forward through abolition, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow. America twisted and turned, but never quite shook its original sin. The civil rights movement carved out legal victories like the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But legislation can't rewrite bloodlines. The descendants of those 1619 captives kept fighting for dignity, for justice, for something that resembled the freedom promised on parchment. Even now, Point Comfort echoes through every debate on race, reparations, and systemic inequality. Those first Africans couldn't have foreseen the strange fruit of their suffering. Jazz, rock and roll, the March on Washington, but they planted seeds anyway. Their arrival shaped a nation, and their legacy demands we keep listening. The White Lion's Landing isn't a historical footnote, it's the headline. The moment the myth of American freedom was forced to stare down its own hypocrisy. Liberty isn't a straight line, it's a tightrope. We're still walking it, still wobbling, and that ship, still there. Not just in the past, but in the mirror. We can look away, but its reflection lingers. What we do with it, how we wrestle with the paradoxes it left in its wake, will decide if we're worthy of the freedom we claim to defend.
Pocahontas.
Entwined in the tangled roots of American myth and colonial cringe, we find Pocahontas, Matawaka, if we're being honest. Her story carries the scent of Virginia tobacco, European arrogance, and the damp breath of a continent caught between freedom and coercion. Reducing her to a Disney princess is laughable. Calling her a pawn, too easy. Pocahontas was more like a bridge made of splinters, fragile, painful, and achingly human. She wasn't the smiling, doe-eyed diplomat sold to you in your elementary school textbooks. She was a young Algonquian woman trapped in the teeth of a world cracking apart. The English settlers were starving because farming without corporate subsidies from the Virginia Company wasn't part of their business plan. Meanwhile, the Powhatan Confederacy weighed diplomacy against muskets, wondering if these pale newcomers could be managed or exploited. And right there in the middle, trying to steer a canoe of agency between survival and surrender, was Pocahontas. If there's a dream in this mess, it's buried in the ashes of Jamestown. Picture Pocahontas smuggling corn to half-dead settlers during the brutal winter of 1609 to 1610, the starving time when people chewed on shoe leather, and maybe worse. Her actions weren't charity. They were calculated exchanges wrapped in diplomacy. The English got food. Her people got a sliver of leverage. In 1614, she married John Rolfe. Not for love. Let's drop that fairy tale. Rolfe was an ambitious capitalist chasing tobacco profits and a publicity boost back in England. Pocahontas? She saw the angles. The marriage bought a fragile peace, a PR-friendly ceasefire known as the Peace of Pocahontas. For a brief moment, mutual benefit outpaced mutual destruction. And then came the shitstorm. In 1613, the English kidnapped her. Not as military strategy, but out of pure desperation. They ransomed her for weapons and food, like she was part of a colonial Costco deal. When negotiations stalled, they tried something worse, erasing her. Baptized as Rebecca, paraded through England like a Puritan trophy bride, she became a living brochure for the Virginia Company. Not Matawaka, not even Pocahontas, just proof that even savages could be scrubbed into civility. Her image was repackaged and sold. The civilized savage narrative wasn't history, it was marketing. Assimilation became propaganda. Her identity was trampled beneath layers of English self-congratulation. So let's cut through the crap. Pocahontas' story isn't a tidy moral fable, it's a beautifully brutal mess. It asks hard questions. Can cultural exchange exist without violence? Can we honor someone like Pocahontas without burying her in martyrdom or noble savage tropes? She died in 1617 at just 21. Disease, brought by the same people who saved her, killed her. A tragic mic drop on the myth of colonial benevolence. But her life, as exploited and manipulated as it was, still pulses with something real. A warning, a question, a call to empathy. Pocahontas wasn't a saint. She wasn't a pawn. She was a person, making choices in a world that offered damn few. We do her no honor by flattening her story. We honor her by wrestling with it, its contradictions, its discomforts, its truths. That's the real legacy, the tension between freedom and force, the thin line between heroism and survival, the reminder that voluntary exchange only works when backed by respect, not muskets. So, let's stop asking whether she was a princess or a prop. Let's ask what her story says about us, and whether we're finally ready to hear it.
Let's give a shout out to the fantastic team behind the scenes. Our executive producers, Ryan Lancaster and Ryan Lancaster, have been the driving force. Thanks to Ryan Lancaster, our sound engineer, for ensuring our voices sound their best. Ryan Lancaster's music composition adds that perfect touch to each episode. Our diligent research team, consisting of Ryan Lancaster and Ryan Lancaster, provides valuable insights. And a nod to Ryan Lancaster and Ryan Lancaster, handling all things marketing and promotion. Special thanks to our families and friends for their unwavering support and the entire creative community. And, of course, a massive shout out to our listeners. Your feedback keeps us motivated. We're proud to have recorded this episode at the Ryan Lancaster Studios, our creative hub. Remember, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of Ryan Lancaster and our guests. Until next time, I'm Professor Ryan Lancaster, and this is the RPTM Podcast.
As we power down the engines of our trusty time machine, we hope you've enjoyed your journey through history without breaking the bank. The reasonably priced Time Machine podcast has taken us on an adventure through the ages while keeping our wallets intact. We've explored pivotal moments, met fascinating figures, and even saved a few bucks for more details, intriguing tidbits, and a chance to catch up on missed episodes. Head to ryanglancaster.com and delve into the show notes. And before we close this chapter, we'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to rate us on the platform you're using to tune in, it helps us keep the chronicles coming. Thanks for joining us on this journey, fellow time travelers.